Hey guys, and welcome to Blind Crime. I'm your host Tess, and with cases like these, you'll never see it coming. I am so excited to be bringing you this week's episode. I realized that in the last episode of Ed Kemper, I forgot to explain what I'm doing for what is probably going to be the remainder of the year. So, I don't do spooky. It's just not my thing. So instead of doing spooky season, we're doing serial season. We are going to be discussing different serial killers, and the first was Ed Kemper. And today we are going to be talking about a serial killer who captivated the United States and left them all in a state of complete fear from 1974 until 1978, with two separate successful escapes in between. I have struggled for weeks trying to figure out how to even tell this story, and I'm still not entirely sure how it's all going to work out, but we're going to give it a try. I feel like this is the prime case of the debate of nature versus nurture. Are people born to kill, or do they learn? Are we, as humans, in all of our flaws, truly evil at heart, and just learn to be good? If you look back all the way in the book of Genesis in the Bible, the first murder took place between Cain and Abel. Cain was jealous of Abel's offering to the Lord, and in his jealousy, stoned his brother in cold blood. Cain wasn't raised with murder in his heart, but he still committed the crime. Was he predestined to kill, or did human emotions simply overtake him, resulting in a crime of passion? Nature and nurture, I think, go hand in hand. And this week, we are talking about a man who, by all means, looked like a well-nurtured person, but his nature was that of a killer. All I can think of when I say that is Twilight and Edward going, "This is the skin of a killer, Bella." But unlike fiction, where monsters are made up of vampires and werewolves, today's case is about a real monster who was flesh and blood, human by all accounts. Although calling him human seems almost too kind. This is the case of a notorious killer, a man who targeted women from Washington State to Florida, a man who was arrested 3 times and escaped custody twice, a man who was diabolical in his treatment of women, a man who felt no remorse, no empathy, a true narcissist if I've ever seen one. This is the case of Ted Bundy. I do want to say real quick before we go any further with this episode that I had every intention of doing an episode every single Friday for the month of October, but life has been lifing and I have just been along for the ride. For the last week, I have not had a voice, and it's still not back fully, but it's a lot better than it was. And there is just so much going on and so many things. So I do want to apologize for my absence. Thank you guys for sticking around and for listening whenever I am able to upload. The good news is that while I haven't had a voice, I have been able to work on the next episode, which I do plan to release on Friday of this week. So this week we will have a double episode, and it is going to be awesome. Then I will take 2 weeks off and be back after that. So things are going to be picking up around here, and I'm really excited about it. All right, we're going to dig in to Ted Bundy now. Theodore Robert Bundy was born November 24th, 1946, to his mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, in Vermont in a home for unwed mothers. Louise was only 22 when she gave birth to Ted, and his father's identity, while speculated, was unknown. Rumors spread that it was one of Louise's co-workers or an old friend, but others thought that Ted's father was actually his grandfather, Louise's father, Samuel Cowell. It was believed to some that Samuel was extremely abusive to Louise and that her pregnancy was a result of that abuse. Ted's birth certificate listed his father as, quote, unknown, and Louise never revealed who the father was, not even after he was born. After Ted was born, it was reported that she left Ted at the home for unwed mothers, but her father sent her back to go get him when she returned home. After she did come back with Ted, Samuel and his wife, Louise's mother, raised Ted as their own, and up until Ted was around 5 years old, believed that Louise was actually his sister, not his mother. When Ted was around 5, he and Louise moved from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to Tacoma, Washington, and this is around the time that Ted learned that Louise was his mother. Louise worked as a secretary for a local business, and together she and Ted had a relatively normal life. Ted was a good kid overall, and although he showed interest from a very young age in things that were less than childlike, he liked knives and sharp objects, but otherwise he wasn't troublesome. In his own confessions, Ted said that growing up, he was just one of the boys in the neighborhood. He said he was one of the best frog hunters in town. About a year after moving to Tacoma, Louise was at a singles hangout at their church where she met Mr. Johnny Bundy. They immediately hit it off, and shortly after, they were married, and Johnny officially adopted Ted, giving him the last name Bundy. And their family of 3 quickly began to grow. Together, Louise and Johnny would have 4 other children. The Bundy family lived in a fairly comfortable neighborhood, and they had a pretty comfortable life. Louise still worked as a secretary, and Johnny was a full-time mechanic. They lived in a modest house, nothing over the top, simple, but it was home. In an interview on the Ted Bundy tapes, one of Ted's previous neighbors said that kids knew that the Bundy family weren't well off, and they weren't popular, but they all played together and they made friends with one another. Except for Ted. As Ted got older, he became more socially awkward and distant. In school, other kids and his teachers would describe him as shy and an introvert. Ted would say later on that he wasn't shy or introverted, he just didn't see the point in socializing with people at school. He also would say that he wasn't confident in himself, which, if you've seen the documentaries and the movies and heard the interviews, you'll understand that he did not appear to be insecure. He would say that it wasn't until college that he began to practice confidence and working on his image. He wanted to appear confident, like he could do or be anything. While in high school, Ted really didn't connect with anyone, especially females. Like Ed Kemper, he felt awkward around girls. But I think that's pretty common with teenage boys. Unless if you're like a jock or something, then the confidence that you have around the opposite sex, I mean, girls are the same way. We all feel awkward around the opposite sex, I think. But Ted was a good student and he got good grades. He actually really enjoyed the learning part of going to school. And overall, he was still mostly a good kid. His fascination with the macabre, though, only deepened as he grew older, and his interest in things of a sexual nature became more and more noticeable. A neighbor even said that he would catch Ted going through the trash cans around the neighborhood looking for naked pictures of women. He wanted to see everything a woman had, no matter how far he had to go to see it. Despite this fascination, though, Ted graduated from Woodrow Wilson High School and began taking classes at Puget Sound, where he would take an interest in psychology. After being at Puget Sound for 3 semesters, Ted met, quote, Stephanie Brooks, whose real name has been concealed for privacy. They were quite serious, even becoming engaged, but after her graduation in 1968, Stephanie moved back home to California and ended her relationship with Ted, stating that he was too immature and unmotivated. Around this same time, Ted had traveled to where he was born, Burlington, Vermont, and discovered that the man he had grown up to believe was his dad, Johnny Bundy, was not in fact his father, and that his father's identity was truly unknown. After returning from his trip, Ted enrolled at University of Washington, where he majored in psychology, and his previous lack of motivation and determination were set on fire. He became a straight-A student, gaining rewards and scholarships and opportunities. He was working at a local grocery store, bagging groceries and stocking shelves, but transitioned from a store clerk to working in the Washington Republican State Senate for Nelson Rockefeller, whose presidential campaign he closely worked on. He was able to attend a Republican convention in Miami, and when he returned to Washington, he began to work at a 24/7 suicide prevention hotline. In 1968, Ted met the woman he thought he would spend the rest of his life with, Elizabeth Kopfler. Elizabeth was divorced with a young daughter. She was working as a secretary and trying to support her little girl. When Ted came into their lives, Elizabeth fell head over heels for him. The way he catered to her and her daughter and made her feel like she'd found her missing piece. After going through a nasty divorce with her daughter's father, she wasn't sure she would ever find love again. But Ted made all of those doubts and fears go away. He settled her heart, and together they created the life they had both always dreamed of. In 1972, Ted would graduate with a degree in psychology from the University of Washington and would go back to work with the Republican Party. He worked closely with Governor Daniel J. Evans, whom had Ted go and follow the Democratic candidate opponent and record all of his speeches. When he was done recording the meetings, he would take the tapes back to Governor Evans and they would go over all of the footage. After working in the political field, Ted decided that he wanted to pursue a life of politics and applied to law school. In 1973, Ted enrolled at the University of Utah, where he would begin his law degree. But unfortunately for Ted, law school wasn't all he thought it would be, and by the spring of 1974, Ted would drop out. Something I was surprised to find out that throughout 1973, Ted was dating both Elizabeth and his ex, Stephanie. He and Stephanie even reinstated their engagement, all while he was still dating Elizabeth. I've heard conflicting stories, but more of them say that Stephanie called off the relationship again at the end of 1973, leaving Ted in a fit of rage. In a few short months, the lives of upwards of 30 women would come to an end over the course of 4 years, all at the hands of the monster himself, Ted Bundy. Before we continue, though, I would like to take a quick break and tell you guys about something awesome that is going to be happening. If you're listening to this podcast, then you are either a very supportive friend of mine, my husband, or a true crime fan who just happened to stumble upon my show. Or maybe you're a mix of all three. Either way, if you're here, you love true crime. We all do, and that's why the true crime community exists. We're here to share stories, to bring awareness to cases that have gone cold, and to bring awareness to certain types of cases. My friends and fellow podcast hosts and content creators all have the same passion, and they are so passionate about speaking out for those who can't speak for themselves. And so I am thrilled to share with you True Crime in Action. True Crime in Action is an annual event that is held by several different podcasters that brings hosts, listeners, advocates, survivors, family members, and many others together to learn about true crime, the inner workings of a case, and what we can all do to have an impact. This year, True Crime in Action will be held at the Hotel Ivy in downtown Minneapolis on Saturday, December 7th, 2024, with a live panel of content creators, law enforcement, victims' families, and survivors coming together to discuss one topic: missing and murdered Indigenous people, with a focus on victims in Minnesota. There will be a live investigation of the cases of Nevaeh Lee Kingbird, a 15-year-old Indigenous girl who disappeared in October of 2021 from the Red Lake Reservation in northern Minnesota, and the case of Jeremy Jourdain, a 17-year-old Indigenous boy who disappeared in 2016, just a few miles away from where Nevaeh went missing. Some of the amazing hosts include The Silver Linings Handbook, The Broken System Podcast, The Consult, Seeking Justice, True Crime PI, Music City 911, and several other podcasts, as well as Ortham Labs, one of the leading labs in solving true crime cases. If you are interested in attending True Crime in Action, you can purchase tickets and find more information on the Facebook page or the Facebook group, True Crime in Action, which will be linked in the show notes. Hotel rooms are limited at a discount rate, so be sure to book while there's still availability. Thank you to Jason Blair and the other amazing creators who are hosting this event. I hope to be there next year. All right, let's get back into the case. Linda Ann Healy had been dubbed Ted's first official victim, although some speculate that Ted had been killing since he was a teenager. Anne Marie Burr was only 8 years old when she went missing from Tacoma, Washington, just 10 blocks away from where then 15-year-old Ted lived. Ted denied until the very end of his life that he did anything to Anne Marie, and DNA evidence cannot confirm that he was behind her death, but many believe that she was Ted's first victim. In 1966, Lonnie Trumbull and Lisa Wick were found in their apartment in Seattle, Washington by their roommate after they were attacked the night before. Lonnie had been murdered and Lisa was severely injured. Joni Lentz, 18 years old, had been brutally attacked in her basement apartment. When her roommates hadn't seen her all day, they went to check on her and found her in bed with her hair matted and dried with blood. She had been raped and beaten and left to die. The injuries she sustained left her with permanent brain and organ damage, as well as memory loss. She never recovered her full memory of the attack and was never able to identify who her attacker was. These are only a few of the many, many women Ted Bundy is suspected of attacking. There are somewhere around 100 to 130 women who went missing during 1974 and 1978. That Ted Bundy was accused of killing, but he only confessed to killing 30 of them. He said in the Ted Bundy tapes that his first murder took place in 1974, and his last was shortly before his final arrest in 1978. So the true number of victims he had is unknown. Now we're going to talk about the women we do know that Ted attacked and murdered. Linda Ann Healy was only 21 when she was attacked and murdered by Ted Bundy. She was a beautiful, tall, dark-haired woman with blue eyes. She worked at a local radio station reading the morning weather reports for the ski lodge nearby. Every day, she would get on her bicycle and ride to work, only about a 5-minute bike ride, and read the weather reports before going to her classes for the day. On January 31st, 1974, Linda did her usual thing, going to work and going to classes. She had written a letter to a friend saying she was going to cook dinner for her parents the following night, but sadly, that dinner would never be made. On the night of January 31st, Linda went to bed, never to be seen by her friends or family again. She was brutally attacked in her sleep and taken from her home. Her remains would not be found until over a year later. Ted would confess to killing Linda before his execution. Donna Gail Manson was 19 years old. Like Linda, Donna was gorgeous with long dark hair. She was only 5 feet tall, but what she lacked in height, she made up for in talent. Donna was an expert flutist and was on her way to being in a symphony. She loved to play the flute and excelled in mastering the craft. Donna was a free spirit, though. She would often go on mysterious adventures, leaving everything behind with no word on where she was going or when she would be back. She enjoyed smoking marijuana and was more than likely high more times than not. No judgment here. This is not victim blaming in any way. That's just how Donna was. She lived her life her way, and she was making it work for her. Unfortunately for Donna, though, her carefree lifestyle would come to a tragic end after an encounter with Ted Bundy on the night of March 12, 1974. Her remains would be found in 1975, but that wasn't confirmed until Ted's confession before his execution. Susan Elaine Rancourt was a 19-year-old student at Central Washington State College. She was majoring in nursing. Her dream job of becoming a nurse was finally happening. Susan worked 2 full-time jobs before her freshman year of college so she could pay for her tuition. She was a hard worker and would do whatever she had to do in order to provide for herself and make her dreams come true. She was working full-time at a nursing home while she was in school and had just met with the school advisors about an on-campus job the night of April 17, 1974. Susan wasn't a fan of the dark, and usually she avoided going anywhere in the dark by herself. But she decided to chance it this time and go to the meeting. She was meeting a friend afterwards, so she figured it would all be fine. She had been taking karate classes on top of work and going to school, so she was sure she would be able to defend herself if needed. Susan wasn't really Ted Bundy's typical target, but for whatever reason, he had spotted her walking out of her meeting and decided that her taller, blonde, full-figured frame was what he wanted that night. Susan never made it to meet with her friend, and her remains wouldn't be found until the next year. Again, Ted confessed to killing Susan before his execution. Brenda Baker was one of Ted's youngest victims, being only 15 years old. Brenda had run away from her Redmond, Washington home in 1974. There is nothing known about Brenda other than her age and that she was a runaway. The day she disappeared is listed as May 25th, 1974, and her body was found just a few weeks later in June of 1974 in Millersvania Park, Washington. Roberta Kathleen Parks was 20 years old when she went missing from her Corvallis, Oregon home on May 6, 1974. She was studying world religion at Oregon State University. Kathy, as she would go by, was tall, slender, and had blonde hair. She just learned that her father had suffered from a major heart attack after an argument between them, and shortly before that, she and her college boyfriend had broken up. So to say her week was not going well would be an understatement. Kathy got the call that her father was going to be all right, and so she made plans to go meet one of her friends for coffee at her friend's dorm in another building. Kathy would never make it to her friend's dorm. Kathy's remains would be found on March 6, 1975 on Taylor Mountain in Washington, where Bundy buried most of his Washington victims. He also confessed to killing Kathy before his execution. Brenda Carol Ball was 22 years old. She disappeared on May 31st, 1974, and was found on March 1st, 1975 on Taylor Mountain. Brenda had gone out to Flame Tavern with some friends on the night of May 31st. She was supposed to join them the following day at a lake across the state, but she decided to hang out at the tavern longer instead of heading out with her friends. She told them she would find a ride to the lake that night and see them later on. It was after 2 a.m. when Brenda left the bar, only Brenda would never be seen again. Bundy confessed to killing Brenda before his execution. Georgianne Hawkins was only 18 years old. She was small, 5'2" and 115 pounds. She had long, dark hair and big brown eyes. Georgianne was a straight-A student at the University of Washington and a member of the Kappa Alpha Theta sorority. She had been contemplating dropping her current Spanish course, but the night before her first exam, she decided to cram for it and try to bring up her grade instead of dropping the course. She had been in a friend's dorm on the night of June 10th, 1974, and had a couple of mixed drinks before going down the hall to see her boyfriend, and borrow some of his notes for Spanish class. Her sorority house was just 6 houses down from the dorm. The street was well lit, and with finals coming up, the entire street was alight with dorm room lights and open windows with students studying inside. People were poking their heads out and chatting with Georgianne as she walked to her house. She was maybe 40 feet away when she turned the corner and disappeared into the night. Before his execution, Ted Bundy said that he saw Georgianne walking down the road and he approached her, asking if she would help him carry his briefcase to his car, as his arm was broken and in a cast. Georgianne happily agreed to help him, and when they got to his car, Bundy hit her over the head and threw her in his brown Volkswagen Beetle. He then would strangle her to death. Georgianne's body would be discovered September 6, 1974, near Sammamish Park, according to Bundy. And I have no idea if I'm saying Sammamish right, so forgive me if I am not. Janice Ott was 23 years old. She was maybe 5 feet tall and weighed less than 100 pounds. She was tiny in every sense of the word. She was blonde and had greenish-gray eyes, which wasn't Ted's usual target type. Janice looked young for her age, too. She looked more like a teenager than a young woman, which I get. I'm 32, and I get asked all the time when I'm graduating high school. Janice was working as a social worker for the King County Youth Services in Seattle, Washington. She hadn't been in Seattle long. She was from California, where her husband of less than a year and a half still resided. On the afternoon of July 14th, 1974, Janice went to the park after she got off work, and after being approached by a man in a cast asking for help with something, Janice was never seen again. Her remains would be found a few months later in September, where many other bodies would be found near the park. Denise Naslund was 18 years old. She was around 5'4" and weighed around 120 pounds. She had long dark hair and dark brown eyes. She was a very pretty girl, and she was well liked by everyone who knew her. Denise was smart, and she was going to school at night to become a computer programmer. She was working part-time during the day to help pay for her schooling, but on her days off, she loved going out with her friends and being outdoors. On July 14th, 1974, Denise was having a picnic with her friends at the Sammamish Park. They had all eaten and had their fun, and at around 4:30 that afternoon, Denise got up and headed towards the restrooms nearby. When she went to the restroom, she was approached by a man in a cast asking for help with getting a sailboat on top of his brown Volkswagen Beetle. Denise was then attacked by Ted Bundy and would not be seen again. Her remains were found on September 6, 1974, along with Janice Ott. And that concludes the Washington murders, which brings us to Ted Bundy's Colorado murders. Karen Campbell was 23 when she went missing from Aspen, Colorado. Karen was 5'4" with long dark hair. You see the theme here? And she was a nurse from Michigan. She and her fiancé, a cardiologist who was 9 years her senior, had come to Aspen for a seminar/vacation with his children. While he was in the seminar, Karen took the kids skiing and sightseeing, and despite feeling a bit under the weather, she wanted to make sure that they had the best time on their trip. Karen and her fiancé ended up getting into an argument that day, though, about when they should get married. She wanted to marry quickly, whereas he was more hesitant to jump into a second marriage. Even though they had argued, the two had made up over dinner and were relaxing in the hotel lounge when Karen went back to their room to get a magazine she wanted to look at. After several minutes had passed and Karen hadn't returned, her fiancé went to find her, but she was nowhere to be found. Karen's fiancé called the police and they began searching for her, but her fiancé eventually had to go back home with his children. He hoped that once he got home to Michigan, he would hear from Karen, but he never did. A few weeks later, he would receive a phone call informing him that Karen's body had been found, and it appeared she had been attacked and likely raped. Bundy confessed to killing Karen before his execution. Julie Cunningham was 26 years old, I believe one of the oldest victims of Ted's. Julie went missing on March 15, 1975, after leaving to meet her roommate at a nearby bar. Julie never made it to the bar, and her body was never found. Bundy confessed to killing Julie before his execution. Denise Lynn Oliverson was 25 years old. She was tall with dark hair and dark eyes. On the night of April 5th, 1975, Denise and her husband got into a very bad argument, and afterwards, she got on her bicycle and rode to her parents' house. Denise never made it to her parents' house, though. The next day, when she hadn't returned home, her husband called her parents, and they said that she wasn't there, and that she had never been there. Her husband called the police, and they searched the area and found her bike and her shoes along the path, but her body was never found. Bundy confessed to killing Denise before his execution. Melanie Cooley was 18 years old, and while little is known about Melanie, we do know that she went missing on April 15th, 1975 in Nederland, Colorado, and was found April 23rd, 1975 on Coal Creek Road in Nederland, Colorado. Bundy did confess to killing Melanie before his execution. Shelley Robertson was 24 years old. Shelley was a free-spirited woman. She worked a part-time job, but often would hitchhike to other states for a fun adventure. When she went missing in July of 1975 in Golden, Colorado, her family and friends just assumed that she had taken off on another adventure. After several months, though, of not hearing from her, her family grew more and more concerned. On August 21st, Shelley's body would be found in a mine in Bethune Pass, Colorado. Her body was so badly beaten, and she was already decomposed to a point where it was impossible to know what her cause of death was. But again, Bundy did confess to killing Shelley before his execution. I do want to say real quick that the way that Ted Bundy's victims were listed online was by state and not by date. I have all of them written down by date, but because of how he traveled and moved around, keeping them listed by date was very difficult. And all of my sources listed them by state. But if you want a dated list, let me know and I can put that up on social media. But that concludes Colorado, and now we are going to move on to the Utah murders. Nancy Wilcox was 16. She lived in Holiday, Utah, a part of Salt Lake County. She was last seen on October 2nd, 1974. It is likely that Nancy was Ted's first victim in Utah. Before his execution, he told detectives that her body, as well as the body of Debbie Kent, were buried in a secluded place outside of Salt Lake City, but their bodies have never been found. Melissa Smith was 17 years old. She lived in Midvale, Utah, and was the daughter of Middale Police Chief. She was 5'3" and had long dark hair. Melissa was a really good girl. She got really good grades, and she was very cautious of her surroundings. With her father being the chief of police, it was easy for her to be cautious. Melissa had made plans with a friend to have a sleepover on the night of October 18th, 1974. She had gone to meet her friend at a pizza place and afterwards went home to get things for the sleepover, only she never made it home. Her body was found near Summit Park in the Wasatch Mountains less than 10 days later. Laura Amy was 17 years old. Laura was almost 6 feet tall and weighed around 115 pounds. Her height made her feel very insecure about herself, often referring to herself as bony and gross. Laura had dropped out of school and was working odd and end jobs while living with friends in Lehi, Utah. On the night of Halloween in 1974, Laura went to a party with some friends, but left around midnight, bored and unimpressed with the party. A month later, on the bank of a river in the Wasatch Mountains, Laura's body would be discovered. She was nude and her face was beaten almost beyond recognition. Bundy confessed to killing Laura before his execution. Debbie Kent was 17 years old. It is said that Debbie Kent and Melissa Cooley could have been twins because of how similar they looked. Debbie was a beautiful girl with long dark hair. Debbie and her parents had attended a play at her high school on the night of November 8th, 1975. Her little brother wanted to go skating that night, so on the way to the play, they dropped him off at the skating rink, and then they headed to the play. After the play, Debbie's parents stayed behind, talking to other parents and teachers, and Debbie offered to go pick up her little brother while her parents socialized. Debbie walked to the parking lot, but after 11 o'clock, when they realized that their vehicle was one of the only ones left in the parking lot, they called the cops. Witnesses said that a light-colored Volkswagen Beetle had been seen in the parking lot earlier in the night, but had sped off after others said they had heard a, quote, terrified scream. They searched the parking lot, and close to where the VW Beetle had been spotted, they found a small key on the ground, one that would fit a pair of handcuffs. The town of Bountiful, Utah would quickly learn what the key went to. Earlier that same day, a young woman by the name of Carol DeRoche was at the mall. While 18-year-old Carol was in the mall, she ran into some of her cousins and they all sat together catching up and talking. While they were talking, a man approached her and said that he was a police officer and someone had tried to break into her car in the parking lot. He asked her the make and model and license plate number on her car, and it was hers. So he then asked her to come look at the car and make sure that everything was still there. When Carol got to her car, she could tell that everything was still there, but the officer kept insisting she really look inside, get in the car, and make sure. She declined, and when this happened, he said she needed to come down to the police station to make a report. He led her to his car and was able to get her to get inside, and immediately Carol knew something wasn't right. When he got into the car, she could smell alcohol on his breath. He took off in the car, telling Carol to put on her seatbelt, and then she refused. When she refused to put on her seatbelt, he attempted to handcuff her and then slammed on the brakes. Carol somehow was able to fight back against Bundy, and in the process was able to open the car door, and she fell out. Once she was out of the car with the handcuffs still on her wrist, she ran as fast as she could. She stopped the car that was driving down the road ahead of them and jumped in without hesitation and pleaded with them to please take her to the police. She made a report, gave them the handcuffs, and she was able to describe to police what the man in his car had looked like. Carol is the only known surviving victim of Ted Bundy, but because she got away from him that night he found Debbie Kent, and her fate was not so lucky. Debbie's body has never been found. Bundy did confess to attacking Carol and killing Debbie before his execution. On June 28, 1975, Ted would commit another murder, the victim being 15-year-old Sue Curtis. There are no details available about Sue or her life or her death, other than she disappeared from her Layton, Utah home. Her body has never been found. On July 4th, 1975, Nancy Baird, 23, went missing from her place of work, a gas station in Layton, Utah. Other than knowing where she worked, no other information about Nancy is available. Her body was never found. Between November of 1974 and June of 1975, Ted kept a low profile. In my research, I couldn't find anything that said he murdered or attacked anyone in that time frame. Whether he did or not, I don't know. I think it's possible that he did and was just never suspected of it or charged with it or confessed to it. But in August of 1975, Ted was arrested. Ted had been circling around a home in Granger, Utah, when highway patrolman Bob Hayward stopped him. When he looked inside Ted's car, he saw several items in the backseat of the VW Beetle that included handcuffs, rope, and a ski mask. Uncertain of what Ted was planning to do with the items, Officer Hayward arrested Ted and brought him in for questioning. Because of the lack of reasoning for his arrest, though, Ted was released soon after and went about his life. That is, until October 2nd, 1975. On October 2nd, police had enough information to bring Ted in for a lineup. With the murders and attacks that had happened, it was prevalent that police find who was behind the attacks. Stories were spreading across states, and witnesses were coming forward with descriptions of a young man they had seen in the area where the attacks had occurred. With that information, they were able to bring Ted in for a lineup. Carol DeRoche and 2 other women were able to positively identify Ted as the man who had attacked them, or had been seen near where an attack had happened. After this lineup, Ted was arrested for kidnapping and assaulting Carol DeRoche. Ted was held in prison until his trial in March of 1976, where he decided to waive his right to a jury trial. The judge found Ted guilty and sentenced him to 1 to 15 years for the attempted kidnapping. Remember, at this time they didn't know Ted had committed any of the other attacks or murders. They had suspicions, but they didn't have evidence to charge him. Yet. By October 21st, 1976, evidence had come to light connecting Ted to the murder of Karen Campbell in Aspen, Colorado. Eyewitnesses placed Ted at the hotel she was last seen at, and his credit card receipts would show he bought gas at gas stations in the area. And Karen's hair was found inside Ted Bundy's car. He was extradited to Aspen, where he would face trial for Karen's murder. In the trial, Ted decided to represent himself rather than have legal counsel represent him, since he had attended law school. Although he didn't complete his law degree, he did know some about the law, but representing himself meant that he would have access to the law library in the courthouse. The law library had windows. The windows weren't locked or sealed shut. Ted was left alone, no shackles or guards to keep him in place. Ted went over to the window and jumped from the second floor. In the Ted Bundy tapes, Ted would say that he practiced jumping in his cell from the top bunk leading up to his escape. He slowly built up his stamina to be able to land the jump without breaking a leg, and when he did jump from the window, he did so with only injuring his ankle. Ted then fled to the mountains where he would stay for several days in an abandoned cabin. He even said in one of his tapes that he ran into one of the people searching for him, but was able to talk his way out of being apprehended. Ted would eventually come back into town looking for a getaway car. He went up to every vehicle he saw looking for one that was unlocked with the keys still inside. It took him a while, but once he found one, he was off, until he was stopped by police and captured again. Differing sources say that he evaded police for either 6 or 8 days, but it was roughly a week. Once he was captured again, he was moved to another, quote, more secure facility in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. But Ted Bundy wasn't accepting his fate as a captive. When he got moved to the new prison, he began to lose weight. He would barely eat and dropped a significant amount of weight in a very short time. With a blade he got from another inmate, who supposedly got it from a guard, Ted began to cut away at the ceiling in his cell, which led to air vents. He was able to cut the hole small enough not to be noticeable from outside the cell, but still large enough for him to fit through. On the night of December 30th, 1977, the day he was supposed to appear before the judge for his charges, Ted crawled through the hole he'd cut in the ceiling, made his way through the air vents, and came out into a closet in an apartment on the prison site where the maintenance man and his wife lived. They just so happened to be gone that evening, so Ted made his way through the apartment and escaped unnoticed. It would be over 15 hours before anyone realized that Ted was no longer in his cell. And I just want to say, that sounds a lot like Prison Break. Cutting through, in Prison Break, they cut behind the toilet, but they used, air vents and plumbing and all that kind of stuff, and it came out in, the storage room, break room area for the CEOs and whatnot. And I don't know, I just think I think that Prison Break probably was like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Let's use Ted Bundy's escape from prison and just modify it a little bit. Like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Bundy ran, and he ran as far as he could before finding a vehicle he could drive. Once he was in his getaway car, he headed out to Denver, where he would then take a bus to Chicago. Once in Chicago, he would steal another vehicle and make his way down to Florida. Ted stayed under the radar for a few days, but it wouldn't take long for him to find the urge to kill again. And this time, it would be his most brutal attack yet. So this brings us to the Florida murders. And I do want to say, I know that I've mentioned a few brutal things, but it does get really bad here. So this is just a fair warning. On January 15th, 1978, Ted would find himself at the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University in Tallahassee. The young women of Chi Omega had spent their day doing their usual things. Some went home to see their families for the evening. One went to a wedding with her fiancé. Karen Chandler and her roommate, Kathy Kleiner, had both been out that day, but reports had them both returning to the home before midnight that night. Shortly after returning home, the two young women would be brutally attacked in their bedroom, leaving them both with cuts and puncture wounds to their heads and faces, broken bones, and Kathy with a broken jaw. Thankfully, the two survived the attack, but not without lasting scars, both physical and mental. Police would arrive at the sorority house shortly after Karen and Kathy were attacked, but several of the girls noticed that a few of their housemates hadn't come out during the commotion of the events that had occurred. When police went to look for the other girls, they found 20-year-old Lisa Levy in her room. Her body was covered in blood. Her left nipple had been bitten and almost completely ripped off of her breast. She had 2 identifiable bite marks on her buttocks. A travel-sized can of hairspray had been inserted into her vagina, and several of her bones had been broken. Down the hall, another young woman was found, lying on her stomach. Police would identify her as Margaret Bowman, a 21-year-old who had just come back from a date. Reports said that she went to bed around 2:30 a.m. that night after talking with one of her housemates about her date. Margaret was found with her skull completely shattered and in a nylon stocking wrapped so tightly around her throat that it was all but broken. Police said they could hardly tell the injuries apart because of how severe they were. Later that night, a few houses down from the Chi Omega sorority, Cheryl Thomas had just gotten home from a date. It was early in the morning when she returned home, around 1:30 a.m., according to her neighbors. Cheryl had just gotten a new kitten, and when she got home, she decided to give her kitten some food and watch a little TV before calling it a night. Her neighbor, Debbie, had yelled at her to turn down the TV at one point, and with that, Cheryl decided it was time for bed. Cheryl and Debbie were good friends, and they often joked with one another about their TVs being too loud. Thin walls made watching TV or doing anything really a less than private thing. So when Debbie awoke later that night to thudding coming from Cheryl's apartment, she knew something wasn't right. Cheryl never made noise that would wake her up. They may hear each other through the walls during the day, but at night, they were pretty undetectable. Debbie woke up her roommate, and they both sat and listened until the thumping stopped. When it did, Debbie called her boyfriend and asked if she should call the police. He said it was probably nothing, but Debbie just knew in her heart that something wasn't right. As a way to keep each other safe and check in on each other, Debbie and Cheryl had made an agreement that no matter what time of night it was, if the phone rang, they would answer. It was their safety net to protect one another. Debbie called Cheryl's apartment, and when she didn't pick up the phone, her roommate yelled, "Call the police now." Once she said that, there was more crashing and banging that came from the apartment next door. Debbie's roommate would say that it sounded like someone was running through the apartment. Police were at Cheryl's apartment in less than 5 minutes. But there was no sign of the attacker. When they went inside, they found a brutally beaten Cheryl. Her jaw was broken, and she had head injuries so severe that she lost hearing in one of her ears that would never return. Nerves in her upper neck had been damaged to a point where she would have permanent damage. Her face was already so swollen and bruised that if she wouldn't have been alive, she wouldn't have been identifiable. It was a miracle that Cheryl did survive. She spent a month in the hospital being treated and recovering from the attack, but at least she did recover. It wouldn't be much longer before Ted would strike again, and this time, his victim would be just 12 years old. There aren't many times when I have to step away from research and writing while working on this podcast. I typically can fight through the hard stuff and then deal with it after the work is done. But for some reason, this case has taken its toll on me emotionally and mentally. And when I began to read about this little girl who Ted attacked and murdered, I had to close my laptop and call it quits for the night. For the entire weekend, I couldn't handle it. And I've put off reading it again today because I just don't want to talk about it. But it's part of this story, and her part of it deserves to be told just as much as everyone else's. So, I'm going to tell it. On February 9th, 1978, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach had just finished PE class at school. She had forgotten a book or a notebook or a magazine in her previous class, which was in another building. Kimberly and her friend walked together to the previous classroom so she could retrieve whatever she'd forgotten. They came back out of the building when her friend remembered that she needed to get something from the room as well. So while Kimberly waited outside, her friend went back into the building. When her friend returned, her friend saw that Kimberly was walking down the sidewalk with an adult man, but she didn't know who the man was. Her friend didn't think too much of it. She thought it was probably Kimberly's dad, so she went on to her next class. No one knew anything was amiss until the school called Kimberly's parents that afternoon and asked why she hadn't gone to any of her afternoon classes. When her parents found out that she hadn't gone to her classes that afternoon, they immediately called the police. Police assumed that Kimberly had just run away and that she would be back, but her parents knew better. Kimberly never missed school. She liked school. She had also just been announced as the runner-up for the school's Valentine's Day court, so Kimberly was going to get to walk with the Valentine's court like they do for homecoming. She was so excited to be able to dress up and make herself look pretty. A lot of girls dream of putting on a pretty dress and doing their hair and feeling like royalty, and she was going to get her moment. So when police said that she probably ran away, her parents just couldn't believe it, not when she was so excited about the next few weeks. Police would interview people at the school and around it, and witnesses said that they saw Kimberly with a young adult man who was yelling at her, and they said Kimberly was in tears. Everyone assumed that it was her father and that she was in trouble. He was making her get into his car while yelling, and despite her tears and protests, no one stepped in to stop the abduction. Kimberly disappeared without a trace, other than the witnesses seeing her with the young man outside the school. It would take 8 weeks of searching, but finally, on April 7th, 1978, Kimberly's remains would be found in a pig pen on a farm. Her cause of death was ruled as strangulation, and there were no signs of sexual assault. But whether by miracle or just luck, there were no signs of head trauma. Although the state of her decomposition made it difficult to say for sure what all had happened to her before her death, police did say that it did not look like she had been sexually assaulted. And I know I said that, but I just wanted to reiterate that. Less than 2 weeks later, on Friday, February 15th, 1978, Ted Bundy was stopped by a police officer in the late hours of the night for driving with no headlights. After running the license plate number, the officer learned that the car had been reported stolen. When he confronted Ted about this, Ted retaliated and the two got into a physical altercation. The two fought for some time before the officer was able to finally subdue Ted and arrest him. Ted refused to speak to the police for several hours, but eventually it was revealed that he was Ted Bundy, wanted for murder and for escaping police custody. Ted Bundy faced trial in June of 1978, one of the very first trials to be televised in the state of Florida. He would later say on his confession tapes with investigators that his trial wasn't fair because of the publicity it received being televised. I'm like, dude, you were on the FBI's most wanted list for murder. Your face was everywhere already. TV had very little to do with that. But the trial went on, and with the evidence of his bite marks from the Chi Omega attacks, the evidence was indisputable. Ted Bundy was the man who terrorized all of these young women. And on July 24th, 1978, after 7 hours of deliberation, the jury found Ted Bundy guilty of the 2 women at Chi Omega and the attempted murder on the other 3 women he attacked that night. 7 days later, Ted Bundy would be sentenced to death. The story doesn't end here, though. Oh, no, not even close. In January of 1980, Ted was charged with killing 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. He was found guilty and received a second death penalty sentence, but not before he got married. That's right. Before the judge could sentence Bundy for Kimberly's murder, he interrupted the court and proposed to his then-girlfriend, Carol Boone. Something about them being in front of a notary made the event official when Boone accepted, and so they were officially hitched. After that fiasco, the judge sentenced Bundy to death for a second time. There's still so much left on Bundy. My gosh. He had a book written about him by author Ann Rule called The Stranger Beside Me. Rule had worked with Ted at the suicide hotline prevention, and she had known him for years, and so, knowing that he had been this monster, she wrote this book. Elizabeth Kendall, an ex-girlfriend, also wrote a book about Ted titled The Phantom Prince. Now, if you search the name Bundy on Amazon or any bookstore, you'll see dozens of books about him that have come out since his murder campaign. Bundy was scheduled to be executed on November 17, 1986, but he received a stay of execution mere hours before he was supposed to be killed. The reason? His mental competency was brought into question during his 1980 trial for Kimberly Leach. Really, his mental competency. I hate. If you go back and you listen to the very first episodes of when this was still For the Record, before I changed it to Blind Crime, and you listen to the Letitia Stout episodes I did, you will know how much I hate when someone tries to claim that they are insane and that is why they did what they did. Ted Bundy was not insane. Ted Bundy, the judge even quotes him as being a diabolical genius. He was not insane. He used his knowledge for evil. That is obvious. Ted would stay on death row for another 3 years before he met with James Dobson, an evangelist. He told Dobson that he only killed those women because he was an alcoholic and addicted to porn. In this, quote, confession, another stay of execution was requested, but in a 5-4 vote, the execution was denied. Now listen, I know that alcohol alters your state of mind. I get that. But blaming your alcoholism for going on a at least 30 confirmed person murder spree, that doesn't add up. I mean, he would say in his confession tapes that he couldn't do anything. He couldn't kill anyone unless he had been drinking alcohol. He needed that liquid courage, but that's not what made him do it. And I don't think that just because you watch porn, that makes you a killer. I don't think that porn is a good thing, but that doesn't mean that it makes you a bad person. That doesn't mean that it's going to make you kill somebody. You have to make that choice. And just like in the Georgia Williams case, the guy who killed Georgia Williams, like, yeah, he was into like the death fetish kind of porn. And he took that way too far. I think that kind of stuff can influence you, just like movies and TV. And I mean, years ago, it was like whatever that video game was that like people didn't want their kids playing because it was going to encourage bad driving. Like, I don't even remember what the game was. My husband has it, but I don't know what it is. But to blame that on being like, I wouldn't have done that if I didn't drink and if I didn't watch pornography. Like, no, because you weren't drinking whenever that little 8-year-old girl went missing in your neighborhood. And if he did that, then what's his excuse for that? Okay. Anyways, on January 24th, 1989, 11 years after his last murder, Ted Bundy was awoken for the last time. At 7 a.m., he would be placed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison, and he was pronounced dead 16 minutes later at 7:16 a.m. Reports that say that there were somewhere around 200 people outside of the prison who all chanted and cheered when the announcement came that Bundy had taken his last breath. Ted left behind his wife, Carol, and his daughter, whom he'd had with Carol. How exactly that happened, I'm not entirely sure because he didn't have conjugal visits as far as I can tell, but people will find a way, I suppose. I do not know what his daughter's name is or where and when she was born or anything about her, but that is probably on purpose for her privacy. I can't imagine growing up and finding out that my father was a notorious murderer who brutalized women just for fun or for any reason. Ted Bundy is without a doubt the most evil, maniacal person I have ever heard of. When I first started researching for this episode, I thought, yeah, this will be easy. Ted Bundy killed a lot of people, but it was all sexually driven, so it's no big deal to research and write down. And I have never been more wrong about something. Yes, he killed a lot of women, and yes, his motives were sexual in nature, but the simplicity of this case and the way that he killed and how often and who and where and when and why, it was like trying to put together a puzzle with a blindfold on. The amount of information and the way everything is categorized, it is all easily available, but it's so overwhelming. I would find something and I'd write it down, and then I'd find something and I have to go back and cross-reference and double-check everything just because of dates and times and places. And I'm going to do something I don't typically do, and I'm just going to say here what resources I used, because there were so many articles that linked to other articles that linked to others, and books and books and books and movies and tapes and everything. So all of my information came from murderpedia.org, biography.com, FBI.gov, the Ted Bundy tapes on Netflix, the book behind the Ted Bundy tapes, Ted Bundy, Confessions with a Killer by Stephen G. McCaud and Hugh Ainsworth, the Tallahassee Democrat, Britannica.com, and allit'sinteresting.com. There is so much that I had to leave out because it was just too much. But if you want to look more into Ted Bundy, then a quick Google search will bring up a lot of the sources I just gave out. All right, guys, my brain is fried after this one, and my voice is slowly starting to give out. So, I just want to thank you guys for all of your support, as always. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, and if you like what you hear, then leave me a 5-star review because it really helps me out. If you want to stay up to date on things, follow me on my socials, all linked in the show notes, and feel free to check out the new merch. There are 3 different designs available on t-shirts or a hoodie, just in time for the cozy season. All right, guys, that's all I have for this week. So until next time, keep your eyes open.